Go right ahead.
All right. All right. So good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Portland Junior Developers monthly meetup. My name is Brian. I'm one of the co-hosts of this meetup and Slack group. Kelly is on vacation this week, and she's actually in a place with no cell phone, no Wi-Fi, so kind of jealous. She's out there, connecting with nature and other humans. So I'm flying solo tonight. But our presenter tonight is Chris Ling. He's going to be talking to us about technical interviews. The Portland Junior Developers Group, we are a wide variety of people. We're folks for entry level, senior developers, in between, people who've never written code, people who want to write code. We're really quite a balanced mix of folks, and we just get together every month. We alternate between these kinds of Zoom meetups where we have a presenter come in and to give a topic, and then we have questions and answers, and then we alternately we'll do a in-person meetup where we'll all just get together and sit around and have some food and drinks and chat about anything. It's very informal. We have no presentations for those in-person meetups. So welcome, everyone. Welcome back if you've been with us before. It's great to see so many people signed up this evening. This is a really great turnout tonight, so I'm really thrilled about it. We've got a lot of folks here. So very popular topic, technical interviews, of course, and Chris is well known to us. He's been in our group for quite a while, and we're in some of his groups too. Many thanks to our sponsor, Clarity Innovations. And yeah, we always have our meetups on the third Wednesday of every month at 5 o'clock. Right now, you've got Chris's presentation, his presentation on technical interviews. Next month on the 18th, we'll be doing our in-person social hour at the White Owl Social Club in Portland. November 15th, we've got Austin, who's going to be talking about, looks like, some CSS. And then December, right before the holidays, we've got our in-person back at the White Owl again, and it'll be a little chilly by then, I imagine. So we'll be with the heat lamps outdoors and all that good stuff. So without further ado, I'm going to go ahead and Chris, just give you can present whatever you like, and it's your show. And yeah, welcome again, everyone. It's great to see everyone tonight.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Brian. Hi, welcome, everybody. I guess I need to wait until you unshare before I get to share.
All
But I
yours.
will. Great. All right, folks. Let's see. All right. Can everybody see my screen? Awesome. Okay, great. So I'm Chris Ling. So I am a senior engineer working in the Web3 DeFi space. I'm in my fourth position, and I became a software engineer in 2017. And right from the get-go, I used to be a career development, DEI-focused professional in my prior career as a lawyer. And so when I made the transition into the tech, I found that I was lacking, in a sense, an idea of what community was, and finding a way to connect with folks who are making a transition like me, where I didn't have a CS background going into software engineering, and I had to learn a lot of these things on my own. I took a big risk. I quit my day job, went to a boot camp, as I think many folks in this space have gone through and survived through it, and have been able to flourish in this new industry. And so this is sort of the culmination of all of the trial and error gut experiences that I had while making this transition into this career. So without further ado, as I think this is the whole tagline of why people are interested, you are not fucked, I promise, is the name of my presentation, or welcome to tech interviews if you need to go and mind your P's and Q's. So as I mentioned, I am a software engineer, an elder millennial, a single father, a lawyer, a DEI professional, and a person who won't get a new headshot. This was from 2019, I think, maybe, when I was like, oh, I need to update my LinkedIn, and I can't put that lawyer photo of me when I was baby faced in my mid 20s. So this is, I think, in my early 30s, and I am about to hit 40 next year. So time for a new headshot at some point. So why do I bring up all these bullet points? Because I think that these things inform why I give this presentation and the work that I do as a volunteer and a community member with regard to making sure we're strengthening and always keeping mind of the pipeline of new engineers, particularly non-traditional engineers in this space. So that's being said, what I know about your pain. And the spoiler is I know a lot about your pain. I mentioned before, I went through a coding boot camp to become a software engineer. In my past career and in this career, have been interviewed by many people and I've interviewed many people. And that means people who are applying to college, people who are applying to law school, people who are applying for judgeships, software engineers, data scientists, and other folks in tech. So I have run the gamut of being able to understand in various roles kind of what it takes to humanize and understand what skills somebody brings to the table. As a result of also being a lawyer and a software engineer, including interviewing at big tech successfully, I have unfortunately deep experience in studying for ridiculous things. The bar exam, in particular, was one of those things where they tell you when you take the LSAT, it doesn't prep you for law school. When you go to law school, it doesn't prep you for the bar exam. So in that summer between when you graduate and take the bar exam, you're cramming 12 subjects in a 3-month period for a giant multiple choice exam, open essay, like a closed universe, all these things that are involve time management skills and a lot of organizational analytical skills that I think are very applicable in this industry as well. So I have synthesized this information and my own personal nightmares in order to benefit you. I never studied data structures in my boot camp, and I never studied it until I was looking for my second job. And I only was able to find resources along the way because my brother had made this transition. My younger brother made this transition a few years prior to me as a result of trying to convince me to make that transition years earlier. And so he could point me in the direction of, look at this book, practice by going to this website. And so I want to impart that onto you. And finally, I mentor a lot of professionals like you all the time, seriously. So what that means is I try not to keep my experience stale. When I lead sessions or help organize interview office hours or other sessions around technical depth and technical skills development, I really try to ask people today, what are they encountering when they're on the job hunt? And like, what are the types of interviews that they're going through? And I try to validate my experience a lot so that I'm, again, never running off of old information. I am currently working, for example, with a smaller group of mentees right now, but a smaller group of mentees for me is 4 mentees. So I usually go from anywhere from 4 to 12 mentees at a time. It sounds really intimidating, but I've tried to schedule it so they're, semi-regular. So I do have a day job. So I am an employed engineer, full-time employed engineer. But yeah, that's what I try to do in order to better empathize and understand where you guys are coming from. So how can I help you? Or more importantly and more accurately, help me help you. So there's 3 legs to how I'm going to approach this presentation for the rest of these slides. And they're centered around these 3 pillars. So I'm anticipating the most common type of technical interviews for software engineers, practicing core organizational and time management strategies to plan, implement, and refactor a solution, and to communicate technical concepts to an interviewer, both when you know what and don't know what you're doing. So we're going to go walk just through each of these. I would say that if you get anything out of this presentation, you're not necessarily going to get what is a cool data structure. I'm not going to tell you like an algorithmic optimization approach to things, but I'm going to give you sort of the beginnings of framework and some things for you to scratch at and an invitation to join our community group, Empathetic, to come to more of our events where we do focus on a particular type of interview, or we do talk with somebody about an experience they've gone through recently. So this will help sort of give you a sense of what's in store for you if you join our community and continue to partner with us as a meetup group. So let's go and break things down. Starting with anticipating the common interview types. Now, everybody, I think, has different ways of categorizing what the landscape of technical interviews are as a software engineer. So this is not, I think, a list that 100% people will agree is the canonical list, but this is something, these are the common buckets that I see in my history of going through technical interviews as a software engineer and what I've observed from others I've mentored and guided along the way. And if anybody has any questions, like Brian, or if you could corral them, please like feel free to interrupt as we go along. I will also be able to answer questions at the end. But I find because we're going to be jumping from topic to topic to topic, that it's kind of nice to break up with questions. So please feel free to ask questions along the way. I just can't see it because I'm sharing screen.
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely, Chris. If anyone wants to ask questions, just write them in the chat box, and Chris, I'll get your attention as they come in.
Great. So let's start with the first category of interview, stack terminology or concept interviews. Now, you might think about this as sort of like buzzwords, or you might think about this as name dropping, but basically this is a Q&A style format that doesn't require you to write any code at all, but to explain concepts, presumably things that you've written on your resume, that you said that you have experience in X, Y, or Z. Maybe it's a computer science concept, maybe it's a framework like React, and understanding things like what is, like what are components and what is the React lifecycle, what is a React hook. And more often than not, when an interview primarily focuses on this style of interview, it's usually like a recruiter or screener interview, an initial technical screen. But I mean, as you get deeper into the pipeline, you end up getting these questions peppered because you're talking with engineering or technical stakeholders. And so they might ask you a question in follow-up to something that you've said, and they might use technical terminology. So that's stack terminology concept, or STC interviews. Moving on, our second style or second category of interview is ownership or retro interviews. Now, for those of you who've gone through a project-based curriculum like a coding boot camp, this is an area where you will be able to shine, hopefully, if you worked on some sort of a capstone project or final solo project or group project. So basically, this is a long-form technical discussion where you're asked to deep dive into a project you've worked on in the past. Now, as a new graduate, that may be, again, your final project. As a experienced or industry engineer, that might be a highlight of something that you worked on in a prior or current position. And so you might be asked to kind of approach it in several different ways. So if you have access to the code base, you might highlight a particular area of code or implementation that you found was very challenging or rewarding or exemplifies the quality of your engineering. You might want to storytell and really chart out the ideation through planning, through prioritization, to implementation, to refactoring, to deployment aspects of following through on that project to completion. And that might be done through a narrative story. That could be done through visual diagrams that can be done in kind of like in a variety of different ways. And this is one area where it really speaks to your voice. And so some people will totally gravitate towards a more visual way of presenting this. Maybe it's a whiteboard, maybe it's an image of what the architecture looks like. And some people are more auditory and can just really orally be able to communicate that storyline. But the idea is to fill the imagination of the interviewer so that they understand, without knowing and watching you write live code, that you do have a familiarity, comfort, and experience in writing and shipping code.
Chris, you mentioned boot camps during this slide here, and we actually had a question from Mike. He asks, would you recommend doing a boot camp to get into the industry?
Absolutely. I think that, but I absolutely asterisk. So in the same way that you should be evaluating maybe a traditional CS degree or any other type of curriculum, and that could be self-study as well, like it is incumbent upon you to do some research and figure out what's appropriate for you. And for a lot of folks, I know that those who are kind of like looking at coding bootcamp options, they feel overwhelmed because there's a lot of choices, and it's kind of hard to evaluate sort of without being an expert or being knowledgeable in engineering what value a particular program is or how rigorous it is. But I think that it's just as valid of an educational experience or a training experience as a 4-year CS degree, and it indexes on different types of skill sets and emphasizing different skill sets than you would in a CS degree. I would say that a CS degree will help prepare you to think more academically or more theoretically with how to approach problems. And of course, because of, I think, the way that we index on credentialism across many positions, that's an attractive option. But I primarily, almost exclusively, mentored folks who have gone through coding boot camps, and I can tell you there are some amazing, intelligent, thoughtful people who have come through those programs and have had amazing and successful careers. So I would say it is a good investment of your time, knowing that you have to still do the work and like figure out kind of what's the right program for you and what value you're going to get out of it. Cool. So let's turn back to what the third category of interview type. Now, this is the one I think that everybody is familiar with and deathly afraid of, is the data structures and algorithms interview. And the reason why, obviously, is because this is the most quote unquote CS of the interview types that exist. So it teaches and tests computer science concepts through writing and executing code, typically in a closed environment and using quote unquote vanilla implementations of a coding language. So you don't have to go and import a whole bunch of libraries. It really is testing sort of the way that you logic or algorithm your way through the completion of a very discrete task that's trying to be performed, and to be able to not only complete it, but in many cases to optimize it with respect to how much time it takes or how it scales with larger data sets in terms of the time it takes or the memory that it consumes when you are implementing a solution. Typically, you're not building a whole app. It's like one method or one function or maybe a couple of functions. And this is the one that most boot camps will not necessarily train you with as rigorously as part of the curriculum, because most boot camps are focused on building project real world experience and an equivalent thereof. And so that's when I started my technical interview office hours, is because I wanted to fill that gap and supplement that information for people who are coming from non-traditional backgrounds. The fourth style of interview or category of interview is the product or system design interviews. So I mentioned earlier product and ownership interviews. If product and ownership interviews are the retrospective version of talking about a project, this is the prospective version of talking about a project. So utilizing a lot of the same communication skills in order to ideate and to plan out hypothetically how to approach an app, a request to build an app that has a certain set of requirements. In this type of interview, for example, in a more product-focused version, you might get asked to build out Uber. And that means like from the database to the API to the front end, what are the things that are going to get you an MVP, a minimum viable product? And you're not writing code. You're just planning out all the pieces and chunks that are going to form what this design is going to be. The system design component, when things are more system designy, they'll incorporate things a lot about scalability and optimization. So whereas the product question might be, how would you build the MVP for Uber? Then the system design equivalent would be, how would you scale if you were to move from US to growing to Europe? Or how would you scale at different times of the day where there's surge pricing or peak hours and peak demand or peak usage? Those are sort of the differences where product or system design interviews can overlap and meld together. I will caveat this with the comment that this is more typically a mid-level to senior style interview, but you might get asked a condensed version of this question, even if you are a junior engineer. And in fact, for the first position that I got at Vacasa back in 2017, they asked me a 30-minute product version of how would I design, like from what data sets would I design a model to predict real estate vacation rental pricing. And so it was a very open world exercise where I said, well, I guess you could get real estate data, you could get weather, temperature data, you could get, like what are the amenities, figure out like kind of like what makes a region attractive and stuff them into a model and price them. And I didn't write a single line of code, but I talked about how I would approach sourcing that problem in order to start creating a product. Cool. So this is the fifth interview type. I think that's right. Yeah, I'm losing track. I should have a little bullet point for myself. This was a little bit more near and dear to my heart, data engineering or analytics interviews, because I started out as a full stack engineer and then moved and transitioned into more of an accidentally first, and then with a little bit of intention into the data analytics and engineering side before kind of moving back into my current position where I still have a lot of responsibilities around data engineering and analytics, but I try to do a lot more full stack work too and front end work. So this interview type is really sort of a flavor of the other types of interviews that we've discussed, but they are more squarely focused on solving data related problems. And there, you'll hear a lot of buzzwords in this types of interviews like ETL, extract, transform, and load. So questions will revolve around, okay, if I were to assume that there's some data source here and I need to collect data from here, and then I need to process it in some way and then serve it in a different form, what would be the logical code, querying, or other analytics processes that serves that information to a business intelligence, business development, or C-suite stakeholder. You might be asked to construct a, like what is a metric that helps us understand who are active users on an app? And they might give you a hypothetical schema for you to play around with, or a hypothetical data set to play around with. And so like questions like this could be SQL focused. So if you're a database person, this is a place where you can really shine. But it also can involve coding to the extent that, again, you might be getting arrays of objects, objects of arrays, interesting data sets, data frames if you're in the Python ecosystem, and finding ways to manipulate this data in order to come to a result. And then there are all these other buzzwords that I could surely answer later about, batches versus streams and metric creation and that sort of thing. And that's kind of the bread and butter of these kinds of interviews. And then finally, for those of you who are, if you are coming from that project-based background, this is the second type of interview where I think you will absolutely shine, or that you should be leaning into heavily, which is a deploy an app interview. So unlike a data structures or algorithms interview, which is vanilla implementations of code in a closed universe, usually solving one function, this is sort of the build an MVP or sandbox app actually in code. So some of you might know of the recently retired Ignite program over at New Relic. And so as part of that interview process, they had deploy an app style interviews where they said, maybe I think as one of the screeners was like, build a traffic light, like a front end that is a traffic light that adheres to certain types of functionality if you click a button. Another version of this might be like build a Pomodoro timer. Like I think that's in a lot of tutorials. So like within a small scale universe, being able to marry like a UI to some functionality and potentially even a backend at some point. And this is unlike vanilla implementations. This will require on some level of knowledge of a modern framework or visualization libraries or some other types of libraries to kind of like, and maybe that's something that is curated by the interviewer, or maybe that's something that's left up to you. But in order to complete that holistic toy app, sandbox app, you're going to end up leaning on, like packages and libraries and front ends and features. So these are overall the 6 types of interviews. And so before we get to the next leg of this presentation, any questions about these 6 types?
Chris, I was just going to ask, on the develop an app, deploy an app kind of thing, what is the strangest or craziest one you've ever heard of from all the people you've worked with or seen? Like, what's the weirdest one you can name for us on that someone's been asked to create?
Oh, the weirdest one, huh?
Or just most outrageous, something like that.
They're usually not like super outrageous, but because like a lot of them that rely on third-party APIs and stuff have to be fairly generic. But I remember when I was at my second company, we used to do a final deploy an app style interview that took the cats API to create some sort of like randomized gallery of displaying cats or something like that. Like and like you could name them or tag them in a certain way. So it was all about the generation of that and making sure that was responsive. We do some weird ones in office hours, and we do weird variations of things. So we do a version of the deploy an app things, which are modify a code base type deploy an app interview. So we'll have an existing UI that you're trying to like fix that's broken, strategically have broken the code in some places. Most recently, I went through like a front end style escape room. So I had a bunch of replets that were like you could link to each other, but in order to figure out what the URL slug was, you had to go and solve like some like silly riddle that was really obtuse, and then basically navigate from room to room. So that's probably the weirdest, is just what we've handled within our organization.
Yeah. Jane had a follow-up question, related question to that, Chris. So what time frame are these interviewees normally given for these, deploy an app type interviews?
Yeah.
And then also how detailed or wide open are the requirements, or how much room is there for you to get creative? So kind of two questions in one. How long are you given to build it? And then, how precise are the requirements that you usually see?
Yeah. And I'll give you the lawyer answer. The quick answer is it depends. But more to Hugh more specifically, I would say that they generally fall into one of two camps. They're either going to be the live coding style, so typically an hour to an hour and a half, where you're working with an interviewer, they're coming in with a prompt, say build these things. But more often than not, we're seeing the take-home style interview, so anywhere from like a 24-hour, 48-hour, or even like a week-long process where they might give you a link to a repo and they say, here, build off of this. Here are some instructions. The requirements tend to be sort of like they range from having a very specific list of requirements. So like, here are 7 things you need to hit. Here's the skeleton of the code base versus it being like, create an interesting implementation of this. And then they'll say, use whatever you want. Just document along the way because they're indexing on different things. So some people are wanting specifically to see if uh, you can understand and sort of like respond to direct prompts, in terms of like what workflow looks like. And other people are sort of like, how do you take initiative and how do you go and interpret things? So company by company, it depends on sort of what their values are, kind of what they're indexing on in terms of a position.
Great. Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, absolutely. Moving on to our second part. So now that we know these types of interviews that exist, how do we practice core interview strategies? Because at the end of the day, when I tell you this, you're like, I have to go and study 6 different types of interviews. What the hell? This is the fucking worst thing in the world. And so I like to think about where can we get the most bang for our buck. So thinking about core interview strategies, things that will apply to multiple interview types. And the first of these, diagram. I talked about this with the concept of like product system design interviews. I talked about this with regard to ownership and retro interviews. And it's really the leveraging different types of visualizations that help get the point across with regard to the 40,000 foot level, rather than writing individual lines of code. So there are many different types of diagrams that people use. Like people use workflow diagrams to indicate sort of high level how to talk about logic as you're walking through how to build like an algorithmic solution to a thing. It might be an architecture style diagram where each of the things, an API might be a square and a database may be a cylinder and Diamond might be a front end, like the client. And so like how those things stitch together. Or it could be like in the more data side, if you're very much like in the data engineering, data analytics side, an entity relationship diagram or an ERD. So basically it's a bunch of boxes that represent table schema. So you'll write, it'll be the column name and then sort of what data type it is. And you'll show the relationships, how they relate to other tables within the database, all in a visual sort of way. Very similarly, cloud infrastructure stuff will adhere pretty closely to that product design style. Like here are the components of a code base. So as a compare and contrast, you want to do this on the left and not do this on the right, which is a scene from one of my favorite shows of all time, It's Always Sunny. This is specifically the one where Mac and Charlie end up getting a part-time job in order to get health insurance because they don't have health insurance. And so they work in the mailroom and there's this person in the company that they work at called Pepe Sylvia. And Charlie is basically trying to like conspiracy theory his way around who Pepe Sylvia is. This is not how you want to approach diagramming because it's frankly insane. But this example that's on the left actually comes from me abstracting a project I actually worked on in my second software position in my first role as a data engineer. So walking through this diagram, what you can see here is that so in that company when I was working on this product, our platform comprised the first 4 objects on the top left. Oh, sorry, the first 3 objects on the top left. It had a front end, a client, a platform that people logged into that interacted with an API that hit a database where the database stored data and information about creating internal job postings within a company, that also had access to employee data, employee resume data, and then could track a position versus applications and kind of state as it related to evaluating each of these applications throughout the course of a year, and this would represent quarterly rotation programs or interesting like introductory internships where you want to cross-pollinate between departments. And this is all well and good. So the first three objects on that diagram represented, like in a very abstract way, the core product that we had. But I, as an analytics and data engineering person, want to run reports and give you stats and give you cool metrics about this. What's the main problem is that I shouldn't be accessing that main database to run heavy queries when people are also using that database in order to go and update their job postings or their resume or anything, because I'll just lock up all the tables and then the functionality of this app fails. So what do I need to do? I need to go and replicate this database on some cadence, like maybe it's a daily cadence, every 6 hours, hourly cadence, to a data warehouse. So an analytics focused data store that allows you to be able to do querying in a more optimized way, specific to reading data as opposed to writing data. And then I can build a reporting dashboard. And this is just an off-the-shelf reporting dashboard that plugs into that data warehouse. And therefore, I can query all of that data uninterrupted. I don't necessarily need real-time data, so I'm not worried about that. And then I can publish reports that I can email or Slack or export to a CSV for our clients. And that was basically a major product or service that I was in charge of building from start to finish. And that was something I did in my second job as a software engineer. So yeah, with a diagram like this that only has 6 items on there, you can really construct and like facilitate a conversation and a storytelling with respect to some work that you've done in the past. Cool. So other strategies. This is the one that is sort of the bread and butter of tech interview office hours at Empathetic. And when I launched this through Alchemy Code Lab back in October 2020. So Scope, Roadmap, Code Retro is more of a systematized methodology on how to approach problem solving. And it takes a lot of inspiration accidentally or intentionally from STAR methodology, where you're sort of like decomposing and breaking down a problem into like the 40,000 foot level down to, like the forest for the trees, zooming into the trees and then zooming back out to have a discussion about the forest that you've created. So what do these 4 parts do? So scoping, starting with scoping, what is the universe and the parameter and the edges of what my problem scope is going to be? What am I receiving in terms of information or inputs? What am I being asked to return in terms of outputs? And so you might ask about like edge cases. You might ask about, am I going to get data sets like an array? If you're saying I'm inputting an array, is it going to be arrays that are no larger than 200 elements? Is it going to be 2 million elements? Like, what am I anticipating and how does that affect how I'm writing code to implement a solution? Road mapping. So without even using any code lingo or anything, can I describe a recipe or a set of instructions that will approach this problem that a human can understand, a non-technical stakeholder will understand? And the analogy I try to write or I try to like put into people's minds are that at the end of the day, like what do computers replace? Or like what does software replace? Humans, right? So in that sense, before we write code, we should think about if I were to ask another human being, a friend, a colleague, some stranger on the street to go and complete some task, what would be the way that I could clearly convey what they need to do in order to accomplish that task? And once you create this roadmap, you want it to be represented in, like whether it's in comments or bullet points or headers in an outline format, so that when you ship code, when you start writing the code, can you translate each of those human readable instructions into a series of like lines of code? If you can do that, then you've sort of achieved that harmony and gotten the benefit of that roadmap to code. And the benefit of road mapping is that by shying away initially from using code lingo, you don't lock yourself into a particular implementation. I've seen so many times when people do mock interviews, they start out with saying, I got to write a for loop. And so now they're locked into writing a for loop where maybe they needed a while loop, or maybe they didn't need to iterate at all in the way that they did. But because they have now said the thing, they have to commit to the thing. And so I'm asking you to defer. Road mapping gives you the chance to really talk about the problem space without saying, I'm committing to creating this variable, creating this method, and making this implementation. And so what happens is once you start building that roadmap, you have code, and then code and roadmap exist in this cyclical relationship where maybe you're writing lines of code and you're realizing I made some assumptions about my roadmap that are proving not to work when I'm implementing a code. And so maybe you need to go and then take a step back and say, okay, what is the larger thing that I'm trying to solve? Why is there a disconnect between my roadmap and code? And you have this virtuous cycle where you're refining each of that high level instruction down to that nitty gritty code based implementation. And so when you're able to go back and forth and have this iterative process, you hopefully will get to a point where you have a final implementation of code or a sandbox app or whatever, and you get to the last step, which is retro. So can I discuss the pros and cons of my approach with another technical stakeholder? If I didn't complete my implementation, let's say I was coding live and I saw I had 10 minutes left and I'm like 80% done. Can I say, well, I know I can't finish this interview right now and write all the code, but I can tell you what I would do if I had an extra 20 minutes or an extra 30 minutes. Can I talk about what are the good parts in terms of like, is this really fast? Or, what is the trade-off? I made it really fast, but in order to make it really fast, I had to go and save a bunch of variables that, like bloat the size of this thing. So I need a larger memory, like larger amounts of memory dedicated to this app. You're going to have these conversations. And so that's an opportunity for an interviewer to kind of see how you reflect on what you write, but also to kind of engage you in talking about what you would do to improve this if you had more time and more experience. So this is sort of like the scope roadmap code retro. Again, I think is something that applies very well to product and system design interviews. I think you can retroactively apply it to ownership or retro interviews. They definitely work for data engineering interviews and data structure and algorithms interviews. So like this methodology is if you don't have a systematic approach, this is a good first step. But I always tell people, don't be dogmatic. These are meant to be a way to provide you with guidelines as you develop your voice. And as you develop your technical voice, you may jettison or refactor or improvise this structure. But until you have the confidence to build with regard to this, you can lean on this methodology to help guide you along the way or help you remind yourself, oh, I've forgotten this part, or I need to address this, like this aspect or this part of the conversation. And so as a demonstration of scope roadmap code retro, here's a sample case study I gave in a presentation years ago using LeetCode. So here's a problem, verifying an alien dictionary. And so without going into detail as to this problem, it's basically assume that there's an alien dictionary or an alien language, and it uses exactly the same letters as in our alphabet, but just ordered differently. And so we're going to get a list of words, and you're going to tell me, based on the list of words, whether or not they're ordered correctly or not. So all you're returning is either a true or a false. And I've like sliced off, if you actually go to LeetCode and see this problem, there's more information at the bottom, but I'm limiting the information to here so that we can ask ourselves some questions about scope. So just looking at this question right now, looking at the information that is in this screenshot, does anybody have any question that they feel needs to be answered in order for them to start working on this problem? No question too big, no question too small. Like this is literally like if you were to sit here and implement a solution, if you were stuck, you'd want to ask me a question as an interview. Anybody? Okay, so let me give an example. So what about how many words should I typically expect in this array of words? That's a great question to ask, because if literally we're going to say the list is never going to be longer than 10 words, then I don't have to worry about time in the same way or memory in the same way as if I were being told there's going to be 200 words. Another question we might ask is, I see that there are a bunch of letters here. What if I get a string that includes numbers? How do I handle that? Should I expect that? So again, I know people feel hesitant because they are worried about sounding unsophisticated, or maybe maybe I should assume, maybe there should be an assumption about this. But let me tell you, assumptions are assuming that people have assumptions, which is a hilarious way to put it, is what's going to make you stuck in these problems. You just need to be open and honest in terms of asking questions, because they're good questions to ask. And you'd be surprised by how many times people have gone into a rabbit hole in a coding interview because they didn't ask questions and they made an assumption. And then they went down this thing, and then the interviewer said, "Oh, you don't have to worry about that at all." And they've wasted 40 minutes of their 60 minutes because they really wanted to solve this thing that didn't need to be solved. So I know that I don't want to keep people hung up on in terms of like analysis paralysis, but here are a list of questions that I think are appropriate for a scoping question. How many words should I expect? As I mentioned before, how many letters in each word should I expect? How do I treat prefix words? So what if I had corn and then I had corns? Like, what's the way? So one is the singular and one is the plural. What should go first? And so like, if for the purposes of this exercise, I will tell you as an interviewer, well, assume that the shorter word is the earlier word and that the longer word is supposed to appear later. How should I handle capitalization? You see that we all have lowercase letters here. So I will tell you as an interviewer, don't worry, the list of words will only have lowercase letters. You do not have to handle capitalization. Or I might tell you, yeah, you need to force everything to be a lowercase in order to do it, because we don't have any sort orders with regard to that. There's case insensitivity. And then should I consider completely improper values, numbers, nulls, booleans? And like, maybe I'll say, if that happens, just return a false. But these are good questions to ask. There's no, when people say there are no dumb questions, literally there are no dumb questions when it comes to scoping, because as an engineer, you know that you have to work with stakeholders who make a bunch of assumptions about things because they're not thinking to the granular level that you as a software engineer have to do. Like, I have to implement. Like, computers are dumb, so you have to be specific. Okay, so road mapping. So once I did this, like, what are the high-level instructions? I gave a few, I talked vaguely or broadly about high-level instructions. So you can see in this example that I have on the right, I wrote them as inline comments inside the function call, and they're meant to be bookmarks. These are to-dos for me to write lines of code. And you can see that I've tabbed these comments as well to indicate, potentially this is an area where I have to repeat the step over and over and over again. And so within that, here's the logic that needs to get repeated each time I'm doing a comparison. So I said, I'm comparing two adjacent words at a time across all the words. I'm comparing each of the letters at the same position until one word has no more words. I have logic that tells me, can I immediately fail or not, or do I keep exploring? And then when I've exhausted the letters of the shortest word, I do this is the whole, like, what if there's a prefix word and a suffix word, like what's a longer and shorter version? What's the logic to handle that? And then once I've made all the comparisons, what do I do if I haven't like triggered any sort of exiting logic? So that's what a roadmap looks like. And what's great about it is if we write code, you can see that I've written lines of code for every one of these comments. And, like, this tells me, so this is the beauty of the road mapping part, is that if you've roadmapped correctly and you've refined your roadmap to code process, if you get to the end of writing code and you notice that you have a hanging roadmap, like some comment that has been unaddressed, it means one of two things. It means you have forgotten some part of the implementation that is necessary to get to a correct implementation, or your assumption about that roadmap was incorrect and you can delete it. It makes no difference. So again, it helps reinforce, crystallize, solidify a plan of attack, and it helps you validate that you have implemented your plan of attack. So this is the real beauty of the roadmap and code cycle.
And if you come back to your code later, Chris, it's already got inline comments, which is great. So
yeah, exactly. So now that I've got this retro, like, I finished the implementation, oh, I'm all sweaty, like, oh my God, like I've done a heroic task. How do I talk about this with the interviewer so that he knows that I wasn't just savanting it and I just like was in a fever dream and I wrote this code and it was brilliant or whatever? They're gonna ask me questions about, like, what is the time complexity? What is the space complexity? You might hear the words or the phrase big O and you're like, big O. I thought we were talking about lowercase letter O. And so like, where the hell are we coming from? So big O is just a back of the envelope way for you to get a relative ballpark as to how an algorithm performs. And we use certain terminology. I know it's algebra. It looks a little weird, but I've gotten a few rules of thumb. So we talk about time and we talk about space. Here are the rules of thumb. And this won't get you 100% of the way all the time, but this gets you most of the way, or gets a substantial chunk. So for time, look at your loops. So if we look, the way that the rule of thumb for looking at your loops are, if they're in the same scope, the same tab, you add them together. You add whatever the difference in time it takes together. If they are nested, then you multiply the number of operations that it takes together. And in this case, we have N and M, and these just represent different things. So in this case, I've said N represents the amount of words that are in the words array. So that means, again, it increases with more words. That's sort of a given, right? Like if you have to make more comparisons with more words, that it's going to, like a larger array of words is going to just take more time in order to complete. And then for each of the words, you have to compare each of the letters. So I just wrote M, which represents the average length of each pair of words we're comparing, right? Because like some words will be longer than others. Some words will have the same number of letters. Some words will have longer and shorter. And so I just picked an average. That maybe is sort of a hand wave, but that gets the point across. They know that you're talking about words have different amounts or different numbers of letters or different amounts of letters. So what's the rule of thumb for space? Look at your variables, lets, consts, vars, and think about what each of those data types represent. So we said, so ignore the fact that I wrote O of 1, but here's the rule of thumb. So when it comes to numbers, strings, booleans, these are, whenever you create a bucket that says I'm storing one of those data types in there, those are constant in size. It doesn't matter how long your string is, it's going to take up the same allocation of memory. So numbers, strings, booleans are constant, and constants are represented by 1 in big O notation. Now, when it comes to other data types like arrays and objects, those can have varying sizes, varying key value pairs, varying indices and values. So that is going to be a function of how are you updating that array to include more values in it or not. And so maybe it's O of N because maybe you're storing a temporary array that's going to have all of the words in there. It's possible. Maybe it's some smaller amount. Maybe it's M representing all of the unique letters that exist. I don't know, but like that's the way that you want to think about approaching memory. It's like how many things are you stuffing into a different data type, a different variable. So in this case, we have a let I equals 0, a j equals 0, and we have lcar and rcar. We have the two consts, two lets. And what are the data types? We have a zeros, so we have numbers, and then we have also numbers for the lcar. No, so we have, and then we have single characters for lcar and rcar, so single strings. So these are all constant. So again, our space is constant. No matter if we are comparing 5 words, 10 words, 500,000 words, because we're recycling those variable buckets. But every time we recycle, it's the same amount of size. So we're only at any point in time updating or creating at maximum 4 constant size variables. So that's the very basics that I can give you about Big O. There's lots of stuff you can learn about it, and there's great resources around there, but this is like the quick and dirty explanation of that. And then you might want to have a conversation with the interviewer about, are there any edge cases? So basically a flip back to where scoping was at, like maybe the interviewer says, throw in this edge case that I told you not to consider. How would you change your implementation? And in that sense, what are some alternative approaches if you didn't have time to write a new approach, but you had an idea of a way that was different and had some benefit in a different way, you would talk about it. So that is scope, roadmap, code retro. And that's the 2 main core interview strategies that I wanted to highlight for purposes of this presentation.
Chris, we have a couple of questions to ask you on this.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna actually start with Andrea's question first because it was most directly related to what you're talking about with the Big O notation. Would strings not take up the same space as arrays because, like, from a certain point of view, a string is an array of characters or so? That was Andrea's question. I guess, Andrea, if you
Yeah,
want to chime in and discuss that a little bit more, about strings versus arrays.
yeah, that's a great question, by the way. And the answer is intuitively that may seem the case, but it's not, because a string will say like, so I'll take a database example of it. So whenever they have like the varchar or text, you can set what the number of characters are, like, like a varchar 255, but you can stuff a one character like a text or a 10 character text, but you've allocated that space. So what happens with a string is you're allocating a maximum size or length of string. And so in most cases, we aren't hitting that. But in the sense that, yeah, strings are array-like. They share a lot of properties, attributes, and methods. I know that seems very palpable or salient, but I'm saying that what's great about what distinguishes an array from a string is that there are different ways to stuff those containers. And we can talk about all varying aspects of arrays, but basically, and this is a little bit in the weeds, but like, so arrays and objects have have a concept known as pass by reference into them. And so when we look at an array, it's a container that stuffs references to locations to different values. The array itself does not exist as an actual bucket of things. It is a bucket containing like ways to direct yourself to other variables. So if you had an array of strings, it's not that it's a single string, right? It's a array of strings. So it's an array of 10 different strings. So we're allocating memory for 10 strings of maximum size. That's why there's the variability. So when we push or we add a new element at the end of that array, that's why, we're not just adding a new letter at the end of a string. We're actually saying create a new string of maximum size that we can stuff into. And that's what makes it like, in terms of the dynamic versus static sizing, that's what distinguishes strings versus arrays in a very like high level sense. Great question.
We've got a question from Reese. So let's say you get stuck during your interviews. Is it like, and I'm assuming Reese, you're referring to a in-person kind of interview. Is it okay to Google some stuff? If you need some help, or is that just like a do not do?
Ask, and this might actually lead to a question like this, my next section, but the short answer is definitely ask beforehand, and the interviewer will tell you what's inbounds versus out of bounds. I would say that at the very least, most interviewers are willing to give you a hint or a leading comment to move you along the way. A lot of interviewers and a lot of companies will say it's open book or open internet. They will allow you to go and do those, but ask beforehand as early as you can. But if you're in the moment, it always is of greater benefit for you to ask. As an interviewer, I'm not here to watch you suffer in silence and to make it awkward. I want you to succeed. I want to end my jobs. I want to end my job search of candidates. So I want to help you along the way.
That kind of ties into another question that she had asked. If you get just completely stuck, I mean, how do you go about asking these interviewers for help, like in a way that makes you look, okay, and not embarrassing?
You just have to kind of like admit it. I have literally gone and said, "Hey, I'm stuck right now. I could really appreciate a hint. Like I'm trying to struggle with what my next step is. I've got it on the tip of my tongue. Is there?" And I can ask, and so I'll directly ask. So like, could you provide me with some hint or some direction? Like in order to move me along. Or alternatively, if it's not critical for you to solve that part now, but you can move to another part, you can say, "Hey, is it okay if I black box this right now? I realize I'm going to need to spend some more time thinking about this implementation, but I would like to work on other parts of this implementation that I don't need this to be solved in order to complete." And that's also the benefit of the roadmap code cycle, is that you have that outline there. It tells you that it's a black box that is going to do that qualitative thing that's in the comment. So you know that the interviewer has seen that you have identified the issue and that you need to have an implementation at some point.
Yeah, that leads me thinking about what you're saying too, Chris. Like, it's, like any other kind of test, like if you get stuck on question number one and you never reach, questions 2 through 9 and 10, maybe better, just like you said, to black box that and just say, hey, I'm just going to come back to this one and then do the stuff that you do know. So at least you're, 80% complete instead of, only 5% complete, right?
Yeah, and this was a core strategy that we did in terms of the bar exam. Like we literally broke down all the multiple choice questions and said we need 90 seconds, spend no more than 90 seconds on a multiple choice question. And if
Mhm.
we're realizing that we're like stuck for time, skip and finish and then come back. Like that is a test taking strategy and it's also an interview strategy to take. Great
Good
questions,
questions, everyone.
everybody.
Yeah, they're really good questions. Thank you, Chris.
Final leg, communication. So we've touched on a lot of this already in sort of the comments and the question and answer. And I realize that we're getting close to the 6 o'clock time. I hope people can stay a little bit longer, and I want to give time at the end to Q&A. So let's kind of breeze through this. So as I mentioned in the comment, speak openly and often. We don't necessarily want answers. I mean, answers are great. As an interviewer, like if you can solve it, that's amazing. But I want to see processes. If I'm going to work with you on a team, I know there's going to be a point where you are not going to know the answer to something. So if you just internalize everything in your gray matter, then I don't even know how to approach having a collaboration with you, working with you as a team member. And so that gives me no signal on whether or not we'll be able to work in a team dynamic together. Maybe that's appropriate if you're like the only engineer and I'm a non-technical stakeholder. I don't want to care and I don't want to deal with all your tech bullshit. Like, but and more often than not, you're working on a team of at least one other engineer. So you need to be able to have comfort and be confident in expressing what you don't know and expressing what you do know. I mean, I used to, in my first job, because I went from a career where I was the youngest in the room to one where I was the oldest in the room by a large margin. I basically said all the time, I was like, hey, I'm the big dumb gorilla in the room. Can I ask a stupid question? Knowing that there are no stupid questions, but trying to break, the awkwardness with a little bit of levity. And people are willing to share. And it turns out that maybe you didn't ask something, you asked something that everybody wanted to ask, but was afraid to ask or did not even think was an issue. So speak openly and speak often. The next one is substance over form. So goes back to the stack terminology and conflict questions. Maybe you froze up because you forgot what the fuck a hook is, or you don't know what parallelism or concurrency means. Ask questions, go to the whys and not the what of what people are asking. So for example, if you don't know a term, ask the question, hey, I don't think I'm familiar with that particular the word or that particular phrase or term. Could you kind of give me a little bit more context? And then I think I might have approached this, or you could just make the assumption, hey, I'm assuming based off of the title of this terminology that you might be referring to this topic. I did that in my first interview for a technical screen where we were talking about parallelism and concurrency. And I said, you know what, like my mind's drawing a blank, but I used to go and wire batteries and stuff. So like, this is what I think of when I think of parallel versus concurrent or parallel versus in series. And maybe that's what you're referring to. And I just kind of riffed on it. But I always admitted up front, I said, hey, I don't know, but I want to hazard a guess. Substance over form. Generalized if unspecialized. A lot of you are looking at job postings and you're saying, this isn't with my skill set. I'm a JavaScript engineer and there are only Python jobs, or I'm a C# engineer and there are only React jobs. Like, I don't know how to talk about this. There's just going to be these job postings that are these roles that are not going to have 100% alignment with your skill set. Like that's the reality of software engineering and getting jobs. But you don't need to have 100% alignment in order to be successful as a candidate. So if you know, for example, like say you in the database world, I use Azure and SQL Server, and you're saying Postgres. Well, they're all talking about databases. 80% of that logic and that terminology and that syntax aligns and it's only the nitty gritty that's different. So instead of being like, well, I don't know Postgres and that's the end of it, you could say, well, I haven't worked in Postgres, but I have had some time working in SQL Server. And here are the typical problems that I see when it comes to creating and maintaining database tables, especially of a particular size. Like we care about indexing. That's something that's going to apply to any database engine. We care about whether or not we are duplicating data across tables or if we can refer to other tables so that only when we need that information, we can access that information. So draw out the general domain behind a specific job requirement, then relate that general experience to the specific use case. And this is more effective with technical stakeholders because they'll know, because chances are, if they're experienced engineers, they've had to go and learn different technologies, but to solve the same problems. This might not be as effective with regard to a recruiter who heard buzzwords and is just looking for the checkboxes. But when you get to a technical stakeholder, this is a communication technique that you should definitely lean on. My first job, 50% of the code base that I was working on was in PHP. Never seen a line of fucking PHP in my life before this job. But my technical stakeholder interviewer knew that I knew how to write code. And he said, you'll learn on the job. And I did. I just read through people's code bases. I looked at other PRs that people wrote and I emulated. I started by copying and like emulating what other people wrote. And then I began to understand the logic and how it connected to languages I did work in. So generalized if unspecialized. So that's it for the technical concepts, which brings us to circling back on how to help me help you. So I gave you a bunch of generalized tools on and approaches to methodologically approach interviews. But what else can you do? You can join our Slack, and I will give a copy of this slide for Brian to share out with the group. But you can go to empathetic.org, and that's empathetic with TECH instead of TIC. We will have a link to our Slack group. We have an events page where it shows a Google Calendar that you can subscribe to. We are starting in October. We are hosting 7 remote events a month. With thanks to some amazing volunteers who are saying, I'm giving a session, an office hour session once a month, or and we have technical office hours like the one that I've provided in sort of this like a 101 of in terms of this presentation. And we also have career development office hours. So if you want a resume review, want to talk about networking, want to talk about the job application process, we have folks who used to be the career services directors and stakeholders at Alchemy Code Lab who are giving their time as a volunteer to go sit with you and to help you like answer the questions you have, because maybe you came from a background where you weren't in this white collar bullshit and you're like, I got to go look nice. I got to go and mind my P's and Q's. Like, what's the right way to do this? Or I don't know how to like talk about what my background is. I feel like I'm full of shit and it's imposter syndrome all over again. They're going to be the right stakeholders to talk to because they've worked with cohorts upon cohorts of non-traditional engineers to help refine those applications so that they can successfully make that transition to software engineer. So we want you to attend or watch one of my intro presentations. This is one of them. You have succeeded. You have completed this bullet point. The third one, read and adhere to our professional code. This is back when we didn't have empathetic and so on, like, which is in the next slide. And then be an active participant. We have channels specifically focused about people wanting to communicate. We have ask early, ask often. So again, as soon as you have a question, ask it, no matter what the skill level. And we have show and tell. So if you have something in medias res or a completed project or a little snippet of code that you want to highlight or share, that's where you want to share those things. And again, empathetic as a community, we have a professional code, and it's really involved revolving around DEI principles. And so these 6 values are sort of the core values that I started back in October 2020. And we've expanded on these a little bit, but these are sort of like the main bullet points. We care about wanting to create a community of respect, self-care, a community, like in the actual sense of the word. We care about our personal and professional growth. We care about being dedicated and not presuming what dedication means in terms of your development as a software engineer. And we care about integrity. So we're not a cheat code, but we're here to do skills development, technical development, professional development. So if you're okay with these 6 bullet points, come and join us, participate, be fruitful and multiply, all the things. And with that, I leave it to Q&A.
Chris, we do have more questions for you. So what were some of the greatest challenges you faced when transitioning from growing and learning solo to working as a team? And likewise, what was the most positive and rewarding parts about growing and learning from going solo to a team? That question was from Jane.
Great. The hardest part of starting out solo was I never got feedback and I was too afraid to ask for feedback. I didn't create a culture of feedback. And one of the biggest, I would say the most explosive and consistent technical development that I've made started when I started mentoring. I started mock interviewing. I started being accountable for being able to talk about what I was learning. And it was scary because I have made many mistakes, but I learned through the DEI background that I had that I could always say, this is where I'm coming from, and maybe I don't know the answer, but this has been my experience. And being okay with people saying that's wrong. I mean, a previous version of this presentation, I wrote a big O analysis that was off, that was wrong. And so I've revised it and I pointed it out. I try to point out as often as I can where I lack information. And again, that transition again of having a community and saying specifically that when you come to office hours, we expect you to fail. We expect you to fall on your feet. We're workshopping. It's just like improv. We're trying to find your voice. Where else can you find an environment where we are willing to go and break the fourth wall and like improvise with you and work on specific skills? I can't think of very many places that will allow you to do that and will do it in a judgment free zone. And that has helped iron sharpen iron for me. I was running office hours at the same time I made the transition to big tech. I worked at Meta for a year at Instagram, and I can credit my ability to make that transition from a Portland company to a small stage startup to big tech based on the fact that I create, that I wanted to I craved the community and I wanted to learn from learning with others. I work in a lot of I work in React a lot now. I didn't pick up React as a skill set until like 3 or 4 years after I was interviewing people with React projects. I told people like that's not my background, but I could like ask questions. And then I realized, you know what? I'm not learning the skill. I need to learn the skill. I have this amazing community of folks who can answer my questions as a new engineer in React. So again, that's learning how to be comfortable with not knowing an answer to a problem right off the bat, and knowing that people, if you are in a community where other people empathize with that experience of fear and discomfort, but are willing to share and help each other, that's where you're going to explosively grow. So it's a mantra that I rigorously try to practice as part of this community. So I hope that answered your question.
Yeah, Chris, we've got another one for you. Answer this one honestly. What was more difficult for you, your technical interviews or taking the bar exam?
So cumulatively, I would say that software interviews are harder. But in terms of all the eggs in one basket, the bar exam was harder because if you failed the bar exam, you had to wait 6 months to take it again, and you couldn't work as a lawyer. And the stigma of failing the bar exam, which is one thing that tried to combat when I was working as a DEI professional, because I worked with a lot of stakeholders who failed one bar exam, two bar exam, multiple times because it's a fucking hard test. And you know that not all folks are standardized test takers. So the stakes are definitely higher in the bar exam, but the accumulation of, I would consider when I was going through the interview gauntlet as a software engineer as a bunch of mini bar exams. And you're just kind of like, okay, I got to do some time pressure thing. Every hour I got to go and implement an optimal solution. Like, so that the fear of God was in me more often, but with smaller stakes. So it really depends on whether you're a marathon runner or like a fucking sprint, get it all one and done.
Excellent. Thanks, Chris. Yeah, David was just suggesting, always, research online the company that you're going to be, interviewing with, do some research on them, try and get an idea of what common questions or problems you might be, thrown at you ahead of time. I think that's some pretty good advice. Definitely look into them and try and mentally prepare yourself for, for what they might be interested in asking you about.
Yep. And the more ubiquitous the companies are, the more there are resources like Glassdoor, like Blind, that will give you insights as to people recalling their experience going through that pipeline. I would not encourage you to use it as a social network because it has a historical tendency, like Blind in particular, of being very toxic and very oriented around the status of what my total compensation is and what equity I'm getting and the status symbol of it all. But in terms of if you're just looking for the approach, like what does the pipeline look like? There are great resources for that.
Excellent. Yeah, we've got some links to the Slack channel that Chris was talking about. I linked we've got a YouTube channel where we post all these videos after the fact. If you want to go watch this one or some of the other ones we've had. Anyone else have questions for Chris?
Can I ask, just raise a hands, or whether, raise hands or not, or like in your video, like how many of you have never done data structures or algorithms interviews? Okay, definitely a substantial cohort. So if you're like, I don't even know where to start, the book you should get is Grokking Algorithms. And it's in Python, but you don't need to understand Python to do it. But what I love about it is there are hand-drawn illustrations on it. They give real-world examples. It's $40 or less. You can get a used copy maybe at the Powell's. That is the gentlest introduction in terms of a book into the realm of like how to approach data structures and algorithms, grokking algorithms. And it's all, yeah, it is also free online. So I love good old fashioned books. So I will buy a book. I would say that that should be your first foray. If you really are like, I know I'm encountering these kinds of interviews, it terrifies me, and it helps demystify that process a lot.
I've been we've okay, another question for you, Chris. As someone who's finished a boot camp for data science and learned Python from a healthcare profession, what's the best way to like break into a technical field?
Right.
From a different profession.
Yeah, and so there is some overlap in terms of the definition of analyst versus data science versus business intelligence versus data engineering. So I would say definitely like Python is the language of choice when it comes to any large data applications or large data context, or yeah, like and so for you to break into a technical field, I would say maybe I would definitely want to pick up SQL, some sort of like experience and exposure to databases. So pgexercises.com is an amazing free resource with a dummy sandbox DB, and it gives you the whole set of like exercises from the very, very basics, like star from table, all the way down to recursive queries. That I like ingested that entire website in a couple of days to prep for when I was applying for Meta. It definitely helped me reinforce a lot of the things I kind of learned along the way through working on the job. So I would say learning that, I would say like explore options in terms of, I mean, like, don't be afraid necessarily if it's like data science versus data analyst. Like those names can mean a large variety of responsibilities. Like some people might say, oh, it means ML models and AI. Some for other people, it's I'm using a spreadsheet. I'm just calculating data and writing aggregations. I'm giving intelligent reporting around that. I'm trying to identify what are salient pieces of information. And then networking with people in there. If you're already like in the field, you know that healthcare is one of many fields where there's a large amount of data that is disparate in terms of like how it's collected and the consistency in which it's collected. There's a lot of great problems to solve around that. So like thinking about like talking with stakeholders in that space and say like, what are the salient problems? And then, trying to like look into ways to practice if there are public data sets, if there are things you can use to practice on to kind of like solve some of those problems or anticipate those problems. That's how I would say like, that would be helpful in terms of approaching an analytics versus a data science versus a data engineering background. If you're going data engineering, you might end up doing a lot more engineering, but if you have a data science bootcamp background, you're well slotted for a data scientist position, a data analyst position, a BI analyst position, because it's just large data sets, right? Like, and you might be asked to synthesize simple things and then maybe move to complex things.
Got another question for you, Chris. So Brian says, I'm a self-taught dev that's been focused more on making personal projects and was planning on hitting the algorithms part really hard a couple months before starting to apply for jobs. Is that way it's fresh in Brian's mind? Is that a reasonable approach, or would you recommend hitting algorithms sooner than that?
I would say that there's a cadence. Definitely, there's like the benefit of hitting algorithms with the cadence. Typically, when I have gone specifically to big tech interviews, I've given myself like a 2 to 3 month period where I'm more or less exclusively focusing on data structures and algorithms interviews. So if you are specifically looking to break into those types of companies, that's probably a reasonable approach. We could talk a little bit if you want to come on to empathetic about how to schedule out problems there. There's resources like the LeetCode 75, neetcode.io, that break down sort of like what are the typical landscape of algorithms problems that you want to hit. From the perspective of just applying to jobs, I would say like getting an intro early on, even if you're not consistently training data structures and algorithms, you should explore it. Yeah, because I think like in terms of that analysis paralysis or imposter syndrome, like that might be the hard, like unless you're the kind of person who's like, I will commit to doing the thing when I say that I'm going to do it. And then kudos to you because I am not 100% consistent with that either. But if you are that kind of a person, then yeah, that timing might seem reasonable. But I think to help smooth and gently introduce your way along the way, you should at least get exposure. Because actually, I find it to be a nice distraction and a fun break from if I'm doing something project focused and I'm like, fuck, I fucked up the CSS thing and I need to go switch gears and kind of like make sure that I am like feeling productive. Like I try to maintain a portfolio approach, generally speaking, when I keep myself warm in terms of like code.
Yeah, I think that switching gears is great advice, like throughout your whole career. I mean, sometimes it's just like, just take a break, go do something else, whether it's not working and just, taking a walk, or just focusing on some other task that's not the one you've been focusing on, so hard. And when you relax your mind off of it for a while and come back to it later, you'll have some insights, and it seems a little easier later after you've let it, taken a break of some kind.
Yeah, and I will not say that this is what the landscape looks like today in terms of interviews. But when I became a new engineer, and for the first several years of being an engineer, I had no side projects. I had no personal projects. I had a couple of things that I highlighted from my bootcamp experience, and like that, consistently being able to talk about those experiences was kind of what I relied on in the past. Nowadays, I think there is a greater reliance on the data structures and algorithms interview of great. Some people will say, "Oh, I definitely want to see personal projects or not," but like at the end of the day, like I think you have to index when you're doing your job search on, like being able to suss out from a company's profile, the way they've written their job application, kind of what you're leaning towards. And if you ask 10 people what's the right way to do it, you'll get 10 different answers. Um, Again, I try to think about things holistically and I try to think about the job search back before all the layoffs and all that stuff. I would always tell people I mentor, I was like, the job search is a 2 to 6 month cycle. Like you just like give yourself permission not to be like, I need to urgently get a job now, because that's going to affect your effectiveness in the interview setting. You're going to be so consumed by the existential dread of saying, I need to get it now, that this is like, I'm not conserving any energy. I'm not building a cadence, that you're going to hurt yourself in terms of self-care. You're going to be more emphatically demoralized when you get a rejection. And it's harder to bounce back from those things. Again, by keeping it as a process and thinking about cadence, self-care, at the very least, even though it's tough, it is tough out there in this market. But that's why it's even more important to really make sure that you are resetting, balancing, you are making things manageable, and knowing that you are already here. If you're coming to this meetup, you've already decided on some level that you are a software engineer. You have completed a program. You have self-studied. You are a software engineer, and so like nobody can take that away from you. And I think that's important to emphasize as you're going through this process. And I know that the job searches can be very long for a lot of folks.
Chris, you mentioned side projects, and John had a question basically exactly about that. So, like, how important is it to have this active GitHub profile with these projects in it? And you, because he went through a boot camp and they were zealots about it. And he says, like, you personally, Chris, like when you interview people and looking for them, is this something that you really look at closely before you interview candidates, or do you not weigh it that heavily?
No, I don't. I personally don't care about your GitHub profile at all. Like I will ask you in the course of me saying prepare for this interview, and I will assume your resume is true, and maybe I'll lose a couple cycles because I didn't like prognosticate sort of like that you were bullshitting me on the resume or not. But if I schedule you for an interview, I will ask you questions and I will make a determination based off of your conversation at the moment. I will give you the opportunity to refocus or redirect if it feels like you were being tripped up. Like that, my whole job is not about making assumptions about folks. I mean, you want to look at my GitHub profile? Like it's fucking terrible right now. Let's just and I know like a little bit of it is like, oh well, you're an experienced engineer now, and you don't have to go and do this. Like go and maintain a GitHub profile. But let me just see if I can share screen on this. Do you want to see?
And
Yeah, let's.
Andy had a question kind of just related to that as well. Like, do you think there's a difference of how valuable it is thinking like contributing to open source projects versus like just doing your own thing on personal projects? Do you give people extra points for if you've seen them contributed to open source, Chris?
I mean, that's like an ideological thing, right? Like I work in a place where we do have a lot of open source projects now. I never had the opportunity to really like focus on that in prior positions. So I think that if you're passionate about it and talk about it, it's a great conversation point to have. Again, I don't consider it a metric that you have to have this or not in order to be a successful engineer. I want to hear what the conversation is. I want to know how you are communicating the materials on your resume. Like, so if you do have a GitHub project that you're really excited about and you haven't committed code in 6 months, but you did work on this thing and you're saying, look at my GitHub profile to specifically look at this project, I will do what you ask. I will not care about, look, I have 40 contributions in the last year on my fucking public open source GitHub stuff. And most of this is sort of like things that I did as a result of empathetic but like most of the stuff I do as somebody, as a community volunteer, empathetic is more like community development. So what I can tell you, like I write code every day or more or less every day, like whether it's a SQL query or it's a Python script or whatever, like, but this does not tell you anything about me. And I will not assume that a blank GitHub profile, if you tell me things and you're saying you're trying to present something that is just not true, I will call you out on that. I had a mentee once, years and years and years ago, who applied to a position at my company, and he's in his interview, he was like, "I love Python. I think it's so great, blah blah blah." And then the technical lead said, "Oh, cool. Like, what's your experience in Python?" And he said, "Well, actually, I haven't started working on a project in Python yet, but I'm excited that if I were to join this company, and that was one of those things where it's like, I get it. Like, you want to show that you're interested in this language, but you gave a wrong impression. And if you had just said, I'd never learned Python, but I'm excited about learning Python, or even framing it just slightly different, or I don't know anything about Python, but I read a couple of materials and a Medium articles, that would have been more than a pass. That would have been a non-issue. But again, it's accurately and authentically conveying who you are. That is what matters to an interviewer, to at least to the good interviewers. If you have folks who are like really into the status symbol stuff, you might just be sussing out a red flag for a place you don't want to work at anyway.
Thanks, Chris. Joey has what I would call like a top 3 question. You're a hiring manager. What are these things you're looking for on resumes? Like, what are you looking out for? What makes candidates stand out for you, Chris?
Yeah, I want you to. So, like, what makes it easy for me if I were to just look at a resume? I adhere personally to like an XYZ parentheses A format. So it is developed X feature or X tool or X thing using Y technology for Z purpose. So the bullet points that succinctly do that. And then the optional A is if you happen to work for a company, what's the metric or the thing that what was the success metric of that thing that you implemented? Maybe you reduced a downtime by 99%, or maybe you increased users by 1%. In most cases, if you're working on a personal project, those don't matter, right? Because like it's a pet project. But again, XYZ format. So, and then be specific. So if I said I developed a dashboard that allowed analysts to be able to synthesize model prediction data and their personal experience to set prices for vacation rentals. That's a long-winded way of saying it, but like you basically developed a portfolio dashboard using, what did we use? We used Chart.js, PHP, and a Postgres database. And I did it for and the metric that is it reduced the amount of manual labor that a portfolio analyst needed to make a decision about pricing. And maybe I don't have the number, but that was what the effect was, so like X, Y, Z format. And what I would recommend too is a lot of folks are talking about, I'm going to use ChatGPT to write my resume, blah, 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 blah. Yes and no. Because, and my philosophy on using a resource like ChatGPT is ask why questions. Don't ask what questions. Don't ask things that are like, change my resume. Ask it things like, what are the things that you would highlight if you read my bullet points in my resume? And then have a working relationship. It's a rubber duck. It's like the wall that you're throwing spaghetti at. That's, I think, the most consistent use case of ChatGPT to still maintain your authenticity and your voice while leveraging a technology that maybe like you're like, it's on the tip of my tongue and I don't know how to express it. You need some vehicle or some tool that helps verbalize it or vocalize it or make it real or tangible for you to iterate off of. So go through review. I read my resume bullet points out loud. I read anything that I say out loud. Any question, any soft skills question, I ask myself out loud. I will be driving. I know it's weird. I'm gonna tell you, but it's true. I will sometimes drive and I will ask myself like, oh yeah, what are 3 strengths and a weakness? Or tell me about a time that you had to pivot from an initial assumption that you made. And I will go and answer it out loud to hear whether I feel like I'm bullshitting or not. So go through the exercises of asking a friend, asking in a mirror, asking while you're driving a car, but don't keep it in here. As you know, you need to verbalize it, vocalize it, make it real, make it manifest into the real world and not just in your mind.
I think that's yeah, we're right at time here, Chris. Hour and a half. That's if anyone else has any quick questions for Chris. If not, if you see him like, seemingly, talking to himself as he's driving around Portland, he's not, he's practicing interviews.
Thank you so much. This is my first meetup, and this was very valuable. The information was fantastic, really preaching to the choir. So I can't wait to join your Slack channel and get more information. I really appreciate it.
Well, we'll be looking forward to having you. Yeah, come to any one of our office hours, participate or lurk, do any of the things. And I'm always an open book. I have an open door, open Slack DM policy. Like, feel free to hit me up with anything.
That's awesome. Thank you so much, Chris. This was great. We had a lot of great questions. Thank you all to those of you that are still online for all the excellent questions. It's always more fun for whoever's presenting and standing up and give this information if you interact with them. And so rather than Chris just talking straight for for 60 minutes, it's getting these kinds of questions makes it so much more impactful. So thank you all for that.
Yeah, thank you everybody for giving me the opportunity to speak. I'm very passionate about wanting to get people jobs, making people feel like honoring the experience of you making this transition. So thank you for allowing me to be a part of it, even in this small way.
All right. Great. Thanks, anyone. And yeah, have a great evening.